This video will be covering the assembly of the VFD Twin transmission. For the first step, locate the molded motor plate and the standoffs located on the parts tree. Insert the M3x12 through the front side of the motor plate into the standoff. Make sure that the end closest to the hole is away from the motor plate. Once you get the screw started, you can put a hex driver through that hole to keep it from spinning so that you can more easily tighten the screw. And repeat that for both sides. Next, locate the top shaft and install a 5x11 by 4mm bearing over the threaded end. Insert that into the back side of the motor plate, and then locate the hard anodized aluminum slipper discs. These discs are not the same. The disc that does not have the larger counter bore will go on first. Locate the molded spur gear and the adhesive-backed slipper discs. Remove the backing material to expose the adhesive and install the disc into the spur gear, lining up with the indent molded into it. Do that on the front and back. Locate the 5x9x3 bearing and put it onto the top shaft, and the spur gear should fit nicely on it. Install the second aluminum slipper disc, and then locate the plastic washer. Color may differ from the washer that you have. With the washer in place, now install the M4 nut. Tighten it down until snug, and then back it off about 1/4 of a turn. At this point in the instructions, it does show installing the motor. You do not have to do it at this time, and you can do it with the transmission fully assembled. Again, there'll be a later video talking about all kinds of different electronics choices for your VS4-10 Phoenix portal. The instructions also show installing the spur gear cover at this point, but we're gonna hold off on that as well. Now we need to install the shrouds. The larger shroud goes on first. The 2 holes that go through the lower portion correspond with those sleeves that we previously installed. Push it up until it is tight with the motor plate. Secure the shroud to the motor plate with the M2x6 screws. After the first portion of the shroud, follow it with the smaller second portion, and then secure it in place with 5 more M2x6 screws. Next, locate the front half of the gear case and slide it over the top shaft. 2 M3x12 screws will attach it to those posts. Next, install 2 5x11x4 bearings into the open bearing pockets. Note that there are 2 different length pins supplied in this portion of the kit. There's a M2x10mm long and an M2x8mm long. We'll need to make sure that we use these in the correct locations. So make sure you pay attention to when the 8mm is called for and the 10mm is called for. We're going to take one of those shorter 8mm long pins and we're going to put it into the top shaft at this point. These are the gears used in the VFD Twin. Note that there are 2 different thicknesses of the actual gear teeth. These 2 gears here have a taller or a wider gear tooth. You can see when put next to these gears, there's a difference in height of the actual gear tooth itself. These 2 gears are what we're going to use in the first steps. We're going to take the smaller gear, which is a 23 tooth, and we're going to put it on the top shaft over that 8mm pin. If too long of a pin is used, this gear will not seat. Next, we're going to locate this bottom output shaft. We're going to put one of the 10mm long pins in the hole closest to the end. Then we're going to slide the 52 tooth bottom gear over it. And now we're going to insert that into the case. At this point, take a 5x11x4mm bearing and put it on the top shaft. This is an easy bearing to forget to install. Then locate the back half of the gear case and install it over those 2 gears. Take 1 M3x12 socket head cap screw and install it onto the right side of the transmission. Then locate an M3x12 flathead screw and install it into the bottom portion of the inside of the case. Before installing this inspection cover over the top of the transmission, we can install some grease into this while it's open. We can now place the inspection cover on the top and secure it with 4 M2 screws. Now we're going to install the first bearing plate. This should fit nicely into the case. You can fill each of those positions with a 5x11x4mm bearing. And then to properly retain that bearing plate, you will need this small piece on the parts tree. That piece will go over this small boss here. and then an M3x12 screw will hold it in place. Again, that small piece is used to hold the bearing plate in place. We'll now need the second 8mm long pin, and that's going to go into this hole closest to the gear case. With that pin now in place, we can find the second 23 tooth gear. This has the slot for the pin. After installing that gear, we need to install an E-clip just behind it. And then make sure that you place a second E-clip here towards the end of the shaft. In early versions of the manual, this E-clip was not clearly shown in the instructions. As long as you have these two E-clips installed, those are the only two E-clips in the transmission. So if you have an extra, as long as these two are in place, you do not need it. Now we're going to assemble the rear axle output shaft. There are two output shafts that do look very similar. The rear output shaft is slightly longer and it has a section with a slightly larger diameter compared to the front output shaft. Take the rear output shaft and slide on this slide dog over the hex section. We're then going to take one of these 5x9x3 bearings and put it on the shorter side. And then we're going to find the rear drive gear. It is the largest gear out of the gears that have this pattern on the back. Install that gear over the 5x9 bearing, making sure that the teeth pattern is towards the slide dog. We'll then install a 5x11x4 bearing on the back side of the gear. And with the bearing fully seated, install one of the included thin shims. This is to keep this bearing from rubbing the bearing that's in the bearing plates already installed in the transmission. We're going to set that assembly down and work now on the idler gear assembly. For this, we're going to grab the shaft that has the longest hex section to it. We're going to take the smallest gear, a 20-tooth gear with a hex shape through the center, and slide it onto that shaft first. We then need to locate this spacer. Each of these spacers has small molded indents around the end of it. This spacer only has one. You can check all around the outside edge and there's only one indent on the end. The rest of all of these spacers have multiple indents on them. You can also check that this matches the drawing in the instructions, which is to scale. Or if you have a set of calipers or a ruler handy, you'll notice that it's slightly over 15.5mm. Slide that spacer over the shaft, and then we're going to put that to the side as well. Grab the last remaining output shaft, and again, first start with the slide dog. Follow it by a 5x9 bearing, followed by the 30-tooth drive gear. A 5x11 bearing will go inside of that gear. And once it has seated as far as it will go, make sure and install another one of those spacers. Now we're going to insert all of those shafts into the case. The first one we assembled was the rear output shaft, followed by the idler gear shaft, followed by the front output shaft. All of these gears should be interfacing with each other. At this time, you can make sure that you used all the correct gears by making sure that everything looks like it's lining up properly. Before we move on to the next step, I'm going to take this opportunity to add grease to these gears. Now we're going to locate the back of the transfer case for the VFD Twin. Locate the second bearing plate and insert it into the back of that transfer case. Install 4 5x11 bearings. And then locate this metal rear dig lockout. Note that there is a plastic piece on the parts tree that looks similar, but it is not the same and it will not allow the dig to function. So this piece goes into the transfer case. The teeth that are sticking out will engage with those slide dogs to lock up the dig. So make sure that those teeth are facing outward. The bosses around the threaded holes will line up with these two grooves in the T-case. So line those up and slide it back into the transfer case. Now, this will retain in that rear bearing plate. It's held in by two flathead M3x12 screws here on the back side of the case. Thread lock is recommended on these screws. Now we can install the two remaining gears into the transfer case. The gear with the hex through the center goes on the idler gear shaft. Before installing the final gear, put one of the 5x9 bearings on the output shaft first. Then slide the gear on with the teeth side facing towards that slide dog. And then install the final 5x9 bearing. And lastly, another one of those shims. Before installing the rear of the case, make sure and add some grease to those final 2 gears. Now install the rear of the transfer case housing over the gear set. Once all the shafts are aligned, everything should slide into place pretty easily. Locate the M3x20 screw to hold the T-case half onto the main transmission, followed by 2 more M3x12s. Now we need to install the shift levers. First, locate the lever that has dig molded into it. This will slide into the transfer case. Next, you need to locate the covers for the shifters. Note that one of the covers has a boss on the back, and that is for the dig side. Once you've located the cover, I recommend now finding the M2x6 screws and putting them through the cover at this point. Then locate the rubber shift gasket. Line up the notch on the gasket with the notch of the cover. And press the gasket over top of those 4 screws. It should leave you with an assembly that looks like this. The gasket is retained by the threads of those 4 screws. Now, by lining up that small tab with the indent in the bottom of the case there, push this assembly over top of the arm. You can hold the shifter in place through the hole on the back side of the transmission, and then thread those 4 screws into the case. Now locate the overdrive lever. This one says OD molded into it. Place it into the housing. And at this point, you need to line up the holes of the shift levers with each other, and then insert this brass pin to pivot them on that same point. The brass pin will sit flush into place, and at that point you should be able to pull on the levers and they won't come out. When installing the levers, make sure that the small boss on the bottom of the arm lines up with the groove on the inside of the slide dog. Now locate the overdrive cover and place it over the opening. Secure the cover in place with the 4 M2x6 screws. With the overdrive cover installed, we can now talk about the set screws shown in the manual. You'll note that there's 2 set screw locations on each side of the transfer case here. Those set screw locations are so that you can lock the arms into a position without having to control it with a servo. The set screws are included and should be installed whether or not you're going to use servos to control this or not, but they're there to allow you to move the arm into position and then tighten the set screw down into a hole that is molded onto each arm. So if you want a low overdrive position, you can move the arm forward and just tighten the set screw until it engages with that hole, and it will lock that arm there. If you plan to use servos to control that, you'll only put the set screws down far enough to plug the hole and not interact with the arm's shifting movement. For this build, I will be using servos, so I'm going to install these M3 set screws only until they're flush with the top of the case. At this point now, we need to install the cover onto the overdrive side of the case. We're going to repeat the same steps that we used on the dig side to install the gasket onto the case. Normally you would have a motor in this already, and at that time you could install your spur gear cover. I'm going to install the spur gear cover, but I will not have a motor in it at this time. Now we can take the assembled transmission assembly and put it into the VS4-10 chassis. With the transmission dropped into the chassis, locate 3 M3x12 screws and loosely tighten them into the transfer case area. With those 3 screws loosely installed, now install the 2 M3x16 screws in the motor plate. Again, install these only loosely at this point. And finally, locate the M3x12 flathead screw and get it loosely installed into the bottom of the skid plate. You want to get all of these screws loosely started so that everything aligns itself. The transmission acts as a brace in the chassis, and this chassis is very stout. So if you tighten down some of the screws initially, it can cause the transmission to tweak and not have everything perfectly aligned, and that can cause binding in your transmission. Once everything is started though, you should be able to go through and tighten everything down. It's nice to do things in kind of a crisscross pattern. That will complete the assembly of the VFD Twin transmission.